You good to go? Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm really thrilled to welcome Anaïs Duplan, Abdullah Qureshi, Aneka Russell, and Gianni Duz tonight for this very exciting presentation that I'm really looking forward to. Very briefly about Residency Unlimited. Residency Unlimited is an arts organization that supports artist residencies, international, local, and national, and curators at all stages of their career. And collaboration and partnerships are at the heart of our mission. Anais, Abdullah, and Oneka are you alum, and I'm particularly thrilled that the conversation and the relationships continue post-residency, if I may say, and that's one very important aspect of Residency Unlimited is this continued relationship. And I'm also very excited to welcome Gianni Duz. And so Anais, I'm thrilled that you came up with this program. You were the one who initiated it, and I'm super grateful to you. So thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm grateful that you were amenable to this idea of gathering artists to talk about my recent publication, Blackspace, on the poetics of an Afrofuture, but more broadly, I think thinking about how artists of color who use digital media and performance, like the three artists that are here today, think about a semantics of liberation. And so, as Natalie mentioned, Blackspace began with a curator residency at Residency Unlimited, where I began to have some of these conversations with artists around how they conceive of liberation. And over the course of I think it was like 6 years that I was working on the book, began to kind of separate out my thinking on liberation into these three frames. So one being as an individual, so me as thinking about my particular psychology, my memories, my beliefs, and the sort of liberation that would be related to that. Social liberation, which I think as a culture we're maybe most used to talking about. So the freedom of Black people or the freedom of queer people, our particular social group. And then a semantics of liberation that is maybe impersonal and has to do with, we could make these broad claims like around the human condition or the universal or the existential. And that one, I think I found was maybe the most slippery one to talk about because my kind of interactions with the word universal were often actually very socially and culturally situated. And, it would be maybe one particular social group saying, this is the universal experience and everything else isn't the universal experience, which is very ironic. And so I kind of am interested to, in thinking about how to share the book with the world. I was less interested in just reading from it. And as a poet and writer, I do a lot of readings and those are fine, but the whole kind of ethos of the book is to foreground artist practices. And so I kind of want to give the stage to practitioners to kind of talk through issues that relate and intersect with some of the things that were in the book. So the way that we'll do today maybe is I will kind of do right now a brief introduction of the three artists. Not just I'll read their bios, but I'll also kind of let you know what they'll be sharing and presenting. And then a little bit about maybe a bit of framing around maybe how what they're showing might relate to some of the ideas that I just mentioned around liberation. And we'll see all the work. And so I'm thinking in order would be, we'll have Diani share first, and then Oneka, and then Abdullah. And I think we can just go without anything in between. And then we can all talk together. And since we're a small group, I don't think we have to do the thing where we talk amongst ourselves first and then the audience talks. I think that we can all in the Zoom room just kind of have a conversation about what we've seen and ask each other questions and things like this. So without further ado, Diani. Diani, producer, composer, sound healing practitioner, and DJ, Diani works in the underground electronic music tradition of sonic myth-making to resurrect spiritual tradition, ancestral memories, generational trauma, and healing. A student and lover of Afro-diasporic dance music like Detroit techno and South African G-Con. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, it's actually with a click. It's calm. Those are
the Detroit-based artist released their debut album Under in September 2020. They will be sharing images and a track from their most recent album Under. And when we were talking about kind of framing Diani's relationship to this conversation, we talked about the power of sound, the way that trauma lives in the body, and the body as a site of liberation. Oneka Russell. Oneka Russell's current art practice focuses on investigating the trope of the othered native within the paradigm of paradise and tourism industries. Her current work borrows imagery, techniques, and formats from the culture of craft and souvenir making in the Caribbean, such as wall hangings, postcards, and gift items. The objects and videos made explore how Afro-based figurative imagery is used as a tool in presenting culture and people as consumable products. The imagery created also investigates the role of trade, migration, and unofficial economies as direct influencers of how representation occurs. Major presentations include At the Crossroads, critical film and video from the Caribbean at Perez Museum of Art, Miami in 2016, and the 2018 Dakar Biennial. So Oneka will be sharing 2 short video pieces and thinking about performance without bodily representation. So I think there's a nice echo there with Diani thinking about the body as a site of liberation and the sort of parallel of what is performance without the body. Also thinking about social posturing and performance, specifically as it relates to Caribbean dance movement. So there's another echo with Diani. And then lastly, Abdullah Qureshi, am I saying your last name right? Okay. Is an artist, curator, and educator. Within his practice, he is interested in using painting, filmmaking, and methodologies of collaboration and organization to address personal histories, traumatic pasts, and sexuality. Through his ongoing doctoral project, PhD, Mythological Migrations, Imagining Queer Muslim Utopias, he examines formations of queer identity and resistance in Muslim migratory contexts. In 2017, Qureshi received the Art and International Cooperation Fellowship at the Zurich University of the Arts, and in 2018, a research fellowship at the Center for Arts, Design, and Social Research in Boston. In 2019, he joined the Center for Feminist Research at York University in Toronto as a visiting graduate student and is currently a doctoral candidate at Aalto University in Finland. So Abdullah will be sharing a video from that mythological migration series and thinking through the intersection of cruising, erotic spaces, and queer migratory Muslim experience. And I'm also interested to hear you talk about an idea around destabilizing the center, which we kind of touched on in our pre-conversation. So that's my little intro. And so I'll pass it off to Diani, and then we'll do Oneka and Abdullah, and then we'll talk.
Hey everyone, thank you for coming. And thank you for the introduction on. So yeah, my name is Diani Dews. I use they, them pronouns. And as An was saying, my major focus and practice is in music production, sound healing, and kind of like collaborative practices and healing work, especially right now. So I will share my screen just so you can see. Okay. So yeah, here I'm just starting off with some brief introductions to just like my performance practice pre-COVID. So this is just a performance I was doing, one of my first performances of my music at MoMA PS1 in Queens, New York. And this was basically I had a video piece that I had created that was influenced by African spiritual deities, specifically from Haiti, so in Vodou, um, that were connected with water, so Mami Wata and Lasien specifically. And so in the back, you can't really see it, but in that background, that image is the video that was playing, and I was essentially playing my music as kind of like a scoring to that. And yeah, just to show you what my performance was looking like. This is 20, I think this was 2018. Time is so confusing these days. I don't even know when, but this is like pretty recent, before COVID hit. But I was basically touring in Europe, and so this was just a performance I was doing in Paris. And so fast forward to June of last year, I decided to move to Detroit because I have family here, and a lot of the music that I was creating for my first album was inspired by Detroit techno, and specifically like Drexia, and different groups that were kind of creating these mythological narratives that were kind of like the foundation of the music. And as soon as I started to hear this music and listen to it and really engage with it about like 3 years ago, it really triggered a lot of just like memory, ancestral vision for me that was, kind of influencing the music. So like I felt like I was scoring to these images in my mind. And so fast forward to last year, I decided to come to Detroit and kind of figure out, okay, what work can I do here with musicians or with try to connect with folks here. So what I ended up doing, especially during COVID, is I kind of, the album has already been finished, and I wanted to be more, because I couldn't actually perform as a musician anymore. That was a huge shift that I had to go through. I wanted to figure out just ways to be more hands-on with music specifically. And so I started to think about, okay, what would it look like to create my own instruments? So here is an image of me working with goat skin, essentially, to make the skin of a drum. And so yeah, there you can see the little process of that drying. And yeah, basically I bought these like standard plastic buckets. This is just the drying process. And yeah, so here, this is like a few months later where it kind of culminated really well into my uncle was curating a show with like 16 different artists. And essentially I had the opportunity to do a sound bath with, with the drum I just created, and just like kind of continue that work that I had already started doing online. I started doing thinking about like sound healing and Reiki. Reiki was something I'd already been doing, and so I wanted to figure out, okay, how can I focus on like the power that sound has on the body, and on healing the body, and the ways that like trauma kind of lodges itself in the body and rests in the body, and sound has an ability to kind of move and shift that, and especially to shift our attention to that. And so I'm kind of always navigating like, how can I use not only sound but also the sound of my voice, the physical, kind of like our original physical tools that we use to create sound, as a means of liberating my own body and just feeling that sense of freedom, and then sharing that with others. So yeah, here's just another image of me playing the drum and people laying in the space. Yeah, so that's my last image. Thank you for listening.
Are you sharing a track, Diani?
Oh yes, sorry, I totally forgot. Yes. Okay, so yes, I'll share. I'm gonna share the opening track to the album. Hopefully I can share the audio.
And could I trouble you to talk a bit about the album itself and how you made it in this particular track?
Yes, definitely. So yeah, the album. So I mean, I started working on this about 3 years ago, and yeah, it again was really influenced by a lot of different genres. I grew up. My dad is Haitian, and my mom is white, but grew up in Zimbabwe, and I grew up just listening to a lot of different genres of the African diaspora and Caribbean music, and that was really influencing the just like the choices I was making sonically. I love just like experimenting in terms of vocally, like with jazz, and just seeing combining that with dance-based rhythms. Because I was really a large part of the making of the album was in New York, where I was a part of the Caribbean queer DJ scene, and so that was a huge influence on just like wanting to focus on music that makes you dance naturally, um, and then combining that with a more emotional exploration of sound that has the power to again like transmute emotions or our mental space. So combining those two things and kind of um, exploring that. So with the album, there was a lot of visions coming, and I think the main one was that I talk about is, I was seeing a woman on the transatlantic slave trade. She was on a slave ship. She was pregnant and with twins, and she essentially decides to sacrifice one of the children and the daughter, and then the son becomes enslaved in the Caribbean. And um, essentially, this narrative starts to like unfold. It's kind of vague at the beginning, but I'm kind of like scoring to it, and I'm trying to understand this psychic relationship of this daughter that was sacrificed with the son that was enslaved. And so, what does that tension create? And especially as twins, I think about twins a lot, and I think twins are a huge part of Vodou as well. Like in the tradition, it's called Rasa, um, as being like kind of like the source of humanity and like in the spiritual sense. And so that's kind of how it's all started. And then, over the span of creating it in that 3 years, I started to really, I had gone through a breakup as well. And so I think I was putting a lot of my emotion in it. And it turned into, this healing, very healing, a cathartic expression of what I was going through. But then it turned into also this, what felt like a past ancestral life healing as well that I was connecting with. And that was in direct relation with what I was healing. So, the biggest emotion being the feelings of grief and the feelings of loss, um, and the tension that creates in our bodies. And so I think, yeah, I'm gonna share like just the opening song to the album. It's called Submerge, and the kind of like the image that I'm imagining throughout the arc of the narrative of the album is like a deep dive into the bottom of the ocean. And so this first song is kind of where we enter that ocean. And it's, it's a very active space, but it also contains a lot of fear because, we're going into the unknown basically. So yeah, let me know if you can hear this. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. I think I was on mute for a while. Okay, it's really nice coming after Diani's piece where as there's that narrative and then it brings me right back to the Caribbean present, which is I think a lot of the legacy of that particular moment of that transatlantic slave trade, and then what we chose to do after in terms of trying to construct a space in the Caribbean. And that's been my preoccupation for a while is thinking about this present moment that it exists where we are striving towards um, integration with Western societies and Western civilizations, but we're still trailing a lot of the ideas that come from before, things that haven't been settled, and still informing our societies and the subcultures that pop up, like dance hall, as Anna mentioned. You're seeing a lot of that struggle coming out, even in everyday life. So I'm pretty intrigued in my work with how the average person, the person on the road, people around you here in somewhere like Jamaica, which has ties to so many places and is so specific. Um, how people are shaping their identity by the way that they hold themselves, present themselves for consumption by the most popular visitor to the country, the tourist, and particularly the Western tourist. And then what that means for the shaping of their identity and what they hold back. Because there's always a surface and always a something behind And I think where I'm interested is in what is that shadow part and how that shadow then shapes itself into, what um, we is consumable and is easily recognizable in Western media, in the things that we sell to tourists, souvenirs. Where I myself have been to souvenir shops in particular hotspots on the island and seen at Jemima figures being sold with Jamaica, painted on it, and just wondering what is happening. What is this mix of something that's made in China that's ordered by an immigrant from Southeast Asia and then sold to somebody from North America, but represents the Afro Caribbean person. There's this weird mix that's happening. Anyway, so I'm gonna share a video, two videos. One where I was photographing friends and then creating an animation of like the patterns and textiles and things that you could find around that were saleable as kind of paradise representatives. And then the next video is kind of imagined performance of a figure trying to kind of escape the trope of tropicality. So let's see if I can make that work here. Yep.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Abdullah.
Should I go? Sorry. Okay. That was amazing. It's such an honor to be part of this conversation amongst all of you fabulous folks. In terms of my work, I guess I can contextualize it a bit. As Anne was mentioning, that I've been working on my doctoral project, Mythological Migrations, Imagining Queer Muslim Utopias. And as such, the so-called European migrant crisis is the point of departure for the research project. And more specifically, I look at challenging spaces of exclusion, such as a nightclub, and challenging spaces of exclusion such as gay cruising sites, which includes dark rooms, gay bathhouses, etc. And you know, the reason I look at these spaces as spaces of exclusion and fetishization is very much based on experiences of LGBTQ immigrants that came in as refugees and asylum seekers, mainly because based on the conversations that I've had, many of them experience this form of double exclusion where they often experience gender or sexual based violence in their home countries, um, and then continue to experience racism, Islamophobia, anti-migratory sentiments in the West. So that was the kind of beginning of this project. Chapter 1, the nightclub, took place in 2019 at a nightclub in Helsinki, Finland. Which is where the research project is based, because that's where my university is. And the second chapter, which is entitled The Dark Room, was supposed to take place in a gay bathhouse in Helsinki last year. And then because of the pandemic, it ended up taking place entirely virtually. And it's interesting that you know, my time in residency Unlimited somehow had prepared me for that moment, because I was in New York in February, and that was just before the world as we know it shut down and is what it is now. And I literally left on the 1st of March. And so my time in New York, I met Anne at the same time, and I met so many other folks who were also looking at cruising and incredible histories. For me, at that point, the starting point, the beginning for this project was very much my own experience. It was thinking about cruising as a problematized space. It was thinking about the act of gay cruising as potentially a healing space to confront one's own shame, one's own trauma of the body, and how, you know, one could kind of be in this space of cruising and reclaim intimacy through anonymous encounters. And that's how I was thinking about it. But then, you know, when the project started shifting and the world changed, we had the pandemic, and we had we saw Black Lives Matter come forward in a huge way. I started reshaping the project entirely. In so many ways, I started reframing how I understood Muslim as a category. I started seeing it as a cultural category rather than simply a religious category. And so it started opening up and started connecting with many of the conversations that I was having with folks from all over the world, but very specifically in New York, with larger BIPOC conversations, mainly because I felt that in so many of these peripheries, if you like, for lack of a better word, people were really confronting issues of the white dominant center. And it's kind of constantly referencing that, even in rejecting that. And I think that for me, then it became important to develop frameworks of collaboration and organization that allowed these conversations from peripheries or margins to come together in a more in a larger way. And so that's how it began. And if I'll quickly show the video so that, you know, folks get a sense of what it looked like. It was scheduled over 4 days. I still worked with the gay bathhouse in Helsinki. I was able to work with a small team of a web designer, a graphic designer, and a producer to translate their floor plan in the virtual realm. Each room had an artist. And then there were 4 days of conversations that were complicating so many of the issues that are linked with cruising, which weren't only thinking about cruising from a BIPOC perspective and challenging histories of fetishization, as we see in the work of Tom of Finland, for instance, or Jean-Daniel Cardinaux, who's a French born filmmaker working with the Arab and North African body, but also thinking about the history of the AIDS epidemic and how that connects with our present moment, or the history of Black men cruising in the parks of Chicago by Derek Woods Morrow, for instance. And then there were perspectives from Philippine as well, trans perspectives or trans perspectives from coming in from the UK and Berlin as well, that were kind of complicating that from the perspective of porn and thinking about sex work as an academic framework. And so many of these conversations took place over the 4 days that actually ended up opening up very much how I was thinking about this area of focus. I'm trying to find where the share screen is. Oh, there it is, sorry. And so, do you see it?
Yes.
And do you hear it? Okay, does anybody have a story to give? Okay, does anybody have a story to give?
The exhibition moving to the internet allowed me to completely create a new persona, a new reality, and shift myself to a form of thinking that wouldn't have normally happened.
The more and more that I make work and the more and more that I go through thinking about the spaces I want to create, it's like, if you're really creating space, who are you creating it for? That's another thing I'm asking of Black folks and Black people, that we can be more than one thing, that queer people can be more than one thing at once. Right? That we can also, we can be educators and whores, and we can also be artists, and we can also really like anime, you know what I mean? And like all of these things can make us like who we are, and that also be allowed.
When we're working with these larger institutions, oftentimes we're trying to push them on some things. How can they expand their language talking about people living with HIV? How can the staff become more empathetic or conscious of the language they use? How can we push institutions to have free programming? Because I think that all institutions, like all of our programs are free with visual aids, but I think that like all of these places should have free programming.
Like, what are ways that kind of queering of ownership in art, like what are the ways that can be brought to institutions?
I want to pray drunk. I want to send a 5 a.m. text to God, because that's when I need God the most, when I've been drinking and fucking my demons away, extracting strength from the people I split open in bed, pulling power from each bewitched moan, every twitch, stitching myself back together with their helplessness, because perhaps if I slit enough notches in my bedpost, I'll regain control. Won't be subject to this shame, this self-hatred anymore, this disgust that eviscerates me until I am pink and gutted.
It hits you very quickly and very suddenly, I think, when you're working. because your references are from where you're from, or where your lineage is from. And in excavating your lineage and your language and stories from, be it Palestinian or Turkish or Syrian or Saudi or Pakistani or Iranian legacies, one thing that I think what globalization has done and what America has done and what colonial powers have done is that they have made us cliches.
All the ways that our bodies as brown people, as queer people, my body as an Arab woman is constantly kind of stretched and pulled and asked to kind of be reconfigured into this way. That is basically me presenting my oppression on a platter for Western consumption.
I don't think that the queer Muslim migratory person of color conversation is singular. And I think for me that has been incredibly important to embed within the framework of this project, that it is a collective conversation. There are many of us that are thinking about this together. There are many of us that are asking the same questions in different geographic locations. And for me, when I was then developing this as a doctoral project, it was very important to highlight that. I think so often there's the expectation that that when we're talking about a research output, it is there are specific authors, and of course I am the instigator of this particular project, but so many people inform that, and for me to highlight the complexity of that has been integral, especially within the artistic components that are organized.
So I guess that's a good place to maybe open it up to others in the room.
Yeah, I want to start with something actually, which is that lately I've been thinking about this idea of practice, artistic practice. And I think that it's a word that visual artists use a lot more than writers and a lot more than musicians. But Diani, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. And I think it's such a useful idea, or it has been for me as someone who does both art and arts administrating, to think about both those things under the umbrella of one practice, which I could call, I've been thinking about what I would call my practice, and it might be something like relational poetics or social poetics or something like that. But I find that having a practice for me has been liberating in that it allows me to go beyond myself and to think about the way that my creative outputs are informed by many different conversations, like you were sort of saying in the conclusion of the video, right? It's not singular, it's dialogic. And that I find that liberating because I get to go beyond the personal. That's maybe like the third kind of liberation I was talking about, the kind of like impersonal one. So I guess I'd be curious for all three of the artists, but also anyone in the room, like feel free to just talk if you identify with having a practice. I would love to hear from everyone. Like, how did you come to define what your practice is? And have you found having a practice to be liberating in any way?
You're mute, I think. Annika,
I'm
you're...
mute. Okay, there I go. I'm always on mute. But yeah, I was saying I'll jump in because I think especially, Abdullah, you were talking about coming from New York in just before COVID. And it's interesting, like you go on something like a residency with the hopes of, I guess, furthering or developing or growing a practice in a certain direction. You go to somewhere like New York for it to grow into certain areas, and then something like the lockdown happens, and then that completely flips everything. Particularly for me, I mean, a lot of the evaluation of what that practice meant before, like joining a system, and participating in certain ways completely changed. Where during 2020, I chose to focus on not what I was personally doing in studio, but how what I could do with a group of women that I have a community with within an initiative could do to assist other artists who might be having difficulties. And so, like, very quickly, the practice became from the individual to the community. And I think it's maybe linked to what you said, Anne, where it's like it's somewhere in between the group and the the administration and the creative. So yeah, it's changed because of the way the world has changed.
Yeah, to pick up from there, I guess I think for me, being an artist and curator and kind of all other things, and manager, was something that kind of happened, quite organically from the very beginning of my kind of artistic, creative, professional career. But I think that they started to reconcile really in the last 3 or 4 years within the context of this PhD project. And I think prior to that, it was genuinely a struggle because I felt like, there was my artistic practice as an artist, and there was my curatorial approach, and then there was education. Everything was like somehow siloed. And I think that is why I sort of started talking more in the framework of this methodologies of organization and collaboration, mainly because I think that allows me to bring in multiple positions to kind of do that. These events always begin with my own film as an introduction. It's not necessarily like occupying the same space as the other artists. It kind of opens up the dialogue as a written chapter would open up. So I kind of really like to work with that in this particular project. And that's where it became easier to kind of have these multiple kind of conversations from multiple positions. At the same time, I would like to say something which was very interesting about the virtual realm. And that was, in some ways, it's been really interesting where we are seeing accessibility to conversations and events and discourses, because oftentimes so many critical conversations happen in what is known as the global north or the west, whatever we want to call it. And of course, artists who are living in the south can't always access that because they can't just travel or don't even have the mobility option because of visa, finances, etc., etc. And so in some ways, it's been interesting that it's opened up that space because people could technically attend this event from anywhere in the world. At the same time, what we saw in my project, which was the first person in the talk, Begum Tara Shakar, Begum had to come up with an entire identity. That is not the person's real name. They had to veil themselves because talking about queerness in the virtual realm also made them more vulnerable and exposed, because now in their home country where they live, exactly, anybody can join that conversation and surveil them, And so those were active conversations that one had to grapple with when putting this event together, because in a gay bathhouse in Helsinki, if that person was flown in, of course, nobody would know what they did. They did their show, they interacted with the community and left, right? They had a great time. But and they were safe to have that conversation. And at the same time, it's not to say that, queer spaces don't exist outside the West, because certainly they do, but they exist in different ways. And I think that has been very interesting for me to witness in this particular time.
Yeah, and just to echo what both of you were saying, I think coming from the musician standpoint, I think my work went from it wasn't completely individual, but I was, creating this work in my room. But I think with music, it was always influenced by the musicians that were around me and just the music that I'm listening to. So I think it's always collective in that sense, but the pandemic definitely impacted, I think, like just my own perspective and my values and like what trajectory I was going in. And definitely went in the sense of like, okay, I'm thinking way more about the collective and what my place is in that. And particularly like, you know, with my healing, music has been a healing modality for me. So when it turning that into the collective, like um how are other people actually accessing that sound in that way as well? So I was really just trying to create community around other sound healing practitioners. And yeah, I think it's ironic that that switch happens right when COVID happens, because then this collective endeavor is all virtual. So it's like, um, but I think again, it's because we're living in such a precarious and a time that is full of grief and full of death, you know? And so it's almost like our values are inevitably going to shift in that sense. Um, but yeah, I think something that I'm thinking about a lot now with healing work, and especially in the Black community in America, is how do we create those safe spaces digitally where people, especially when it comes to like colorism and anti-Blackness, and you know, having these hard conversations around like whether people feel comfortable or not in certain spaces. Um, and yeah, so that's definitely been on my mind.
Yeah, you all brought up spaces of music like nightclubs, and Onika, you didn't bring up the spaces specifically, but when I think about dance hall, I always see spaces full of people. Like I always see people. And so I'm curious. I'm curious, you know, is that totally lost now in our kind of digital Zoom moment? And you know, I've seen lots of like Zoom parties or like Zoom DJ nights or whatever, but obviously people aren't like sweating on each other, like something. So they're different spaces, and I'm curious, you know, whether you all have felt a loss recently, or and maybe what is gained. We talked a little bit about like safety, but I don't know if that even
Yeah,
question, but yeah.
yeah, that's a very interesting question. Which I haven't really thought about, but but I think the Caribbean is, particularly Jamaica, is known for its rebelliousness. And so when people should not be sweating on each other, the sweating happens anyways. Um, but yeah, I think what an interesting culture has happened where yeah, the Zoom parties have really taken off, where people have started to create almost like nightclubs within their home space. So the last major one being New Year's Eve, New Year's Eve. Um, there were actual like setups, so you could view, and I thought it was really interesting. People started to recreate the nightclub within the home space, invited those that were safe for them, and then you had almost like 100 nightclubs being shown on these screens. So I thought it was such a surreal experience, and you are also in your own nightclub, transported, through this main DJ that flips to these different nightclubs. So it's become an amazing experience, and it told me how important this social activity of the dance space is to us, that nothing, and it will transfer and flow into the digital in its own way. Yeah.
Yeah, I DJ'd a couple like virtual Zooms when COVID first hit, and you know it was like a bunch of people, and it was really fun. And I was actually really surprised at how how I was energized by it, you know, just in my own room. But then just being able to witness other people dancing in their rooms, and like there's something that's unique about, like, of course we all have this bittersweet feeling of like, oh, we wish we could dance together. But then there's this other unique experience of observing each other in the safety of each other's homes, and a lot of people feeling almost like more free in a certain sense to just be themselves. and still it's still being this collective experience. So it's really interesting.
Well, maybe I can like pick on you to talk more about an idea that you brought up in our conversation before around the body as a site of liberation. And I know you're speaking about it specifically in relation to gender, and I think of you as my like Haitian trans brother. But yeah, I don't know if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think that was a huge aspect of the album too that I didn't touch on, but of, you know, at the end of finishing it, it's like I started to really understand that tension of like the twins was also reflecting and mirrored in the tension of my own inner like masculine and feminine and what that means to me. And so, you know, coming into like being non-binary, being trans, and now embarking on transitioning medically, like, you know, all of I can't like separate that journey from like my spiritual connection to my ancestry, but also how music and spirituality play a key role um, in all of that. So I think when it comes to like my body specifically, it's been exactly that, like a site where I could feel agency, a site where I can um, explore like what makes me feel good, you know, and then doing all of that in quarantine is another layer to it because like this is also like a social experience as well, you know. So um yeah, it's really interesting to experience like euphoric moments and sites of liberation with my body, but then expressing that virtually and then having that being affirmed in these healing spaces that I found with other like Black trans healers and, you know, on our conversations um, virtually too. So there's actually been a lot of access, you know, and that's a privilege as well, like access to healing, access to spaces where we can connect and can affirm each other in these experiences. Because I think that's most important, and to know that we're not like alone. Yeah.
I have more thoughts, but I want to step back in case anyone, artist or audience, wants to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, Danny, am I on mute?
No, I can hear you.
I'm good. I'm good. Okay. Yeah, so I also listened to that first track, I think it's Submerge, right? Yeah. And I don't know, before this was before you talked about that narrative of being on that journey, and um I felt that it felt ancient as well as modern at the same time. And it felt like I was here and there. And, you know, before you talked about kind of feeling disembodied or, you know, kind of outside of yourself. I just wonder how you approach um, the sound in that way. What are some of the choices with the type of references, you know, that you draw from? I'm really curious about how something can feel neither old or new, but both. And it's really to what you're saying about that the twins. Um,
Yeah.
I relate it to that. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think so. The main element that I say that I always connect with, especially with albums, is the element of water. And I think about the fluidity of water. I always think about like how just like our roots as a species, as humans, is born of water. You know, just the with that ancestral experience and vision that I was picking up on, it's like these are the birthing process and like that being we're kind of encompassed in water when we're in the womb, and like that kind of being our first place where we enter the world and feeling safe and all those things. So um I think that's what I was trying to sonically explore. And Whether it was, specific rhythms that I felt, these are like, I guess, influenced by, Haitian and Caribbean and Afro-diasporic sounds, specifically like Vodou drumming. I was listening to a lot of that too. And that kind of impacting these images in my mind. So like thinking about like how drumming has always been a very powerful tool for slaves, especially in Haiti, that contributed to revolution. And yeah, I think when I think about, these major things such as revolution and our experience and our roots in water, it's like I'm trying to like find those connections that kind of transcend, I guess, transcend the human experience as well at the same time, if that makes sense. So like making those connections. So a lot of it was also like just using my voice. And I think it's funny because there's a lot of songs in the album where you think it's a digital sound, but it's actually a lot of recordings of my voice that I've manipulated to sound digital. So it's like this analog feel, and I think I wanted to create that because it kind of it questions like what's digital, what's analog, and how the voice is kind of like, and our bodies are like the original technology. You know what I mean? Where that give us access to a lot of like ancient wisdom and ancient knowledge that we can tap into just by exploring it. So yeah, I think that's what I was trying to achieve.
I have a question for Aneka. Aneka, I was struck by the use of sound in your videos.
Yes.
And you don't really talk, I mean, you haven't mentioned it. So I'm very curious about, because it seems to be a very kind of prominent, it has a very prominent, it's not, how can I say, I'm just very curious how you go about the use of sound in your videos.
Yeah. I guess that's a really good point. That I guess as a visual artist, I tend to lead with the visual as the kind of but as that sets up a hierarchy that probably is something I need to rethink. But actually, sound, I do spend a lot of time choosing the sound and editing and relate to a lot of what Diane is saying about one, picking things that sound very generic. Um, so a lot of it are choices that I'm choosing loops that are very recognizable from packages that everybody has access to, and then also manipulating it in ways so that it no longer sounds generic, and then taking things even in relation to the visual, some things that are visual that look generic are actually created from scratch, and then some things that, so there's a flip, uh, sometimes the sound is meant to kind of place you in a tense state. For example, that first video that we looked at, um, I'm aware that when you look at those two figures in that space, you are not really sure what is happening, how you should relate to these people, nor are they particularly sure how they should relate to each other. And so the sound is chosen to, in a way, aggravate, but also entice. And I think I'm always working with um, the idea of push and pull, like come here, go away, with the work. What is unpleasant and pleasant at the same time. So that's kind of how I'm approaching sound a lot, because ultimately it's creating like this experience when you encounter the work, which is the visual and the sound that you create.
Maybe if one more person has a question or thought, and then we can part ways.
I think I had a question before. Is there someone else?
Oh, Peter, did you want to ask something?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I do have a question actually, and this is for anybody who wants to answer it. I've been just reading this book about spaces for Latinx artists, and like and I think it translates into all people of color. And I also have a friend who is an artist who makes art, and I was thinking about this looking at the work here. Makes art that is not necessarily commodity. In other words, like not sellable, but she's at a point where she has to start thinking about the economics of making. And so I'm wondering, for all three of you, how much do you think at this point in your careers of the economics of making, of making something that is a commodity for people to purchase?
I could go, if that's okay, quickly. I guess I navigate between that space for sure. I mean, I'm a painter, and for a long time I've been painting. I've been coming back to painting now. And then at the same time, I've been doing these, what I term as experimental projects and kind of time-based projects or live events that obviously they're not tangible the same way. I think that for me, like the way it's worked is that I think it's like, like I've been fortunate. I think academia played a big role for me in kind of securing a base for me, if you like, for lack of a better way of saying it. I think I was able to kind of, like, the institutional structure allowed me to access funding that would ultimately allow me to take more risks with art making. I find that, I've always wanted to be experimental, but of course that liberty is not always afforded when one is young or earlier in their career. It took me about 10 years, which I'm still grateful for, to be at that place where I was able to take more and more risks in art making and do projects that don't always have to sell. And so I think everybody obviously has to find their own kind of avenues. I think that this is also an important question for institutions and policymakers, because I think that it's really not the artist's role to be tapping into funding. I mean, that's why many of us end up being arts managers at the same time, because we kind of have to be applying for funding and kind of applying for these avenues if we want to do projects that we care about. But really, the institution should work harder to support these kind of experimental projects, because without that, we have nothing. I mean, we see that in spaces. I mean, I won't take more space, but I think that in places where there isn't arts funding, you see the impact of that on the cultural sector, where it is only art that is made for selling, because artists won't then have that kind of critical space to take risks. So essentially, if we want criticality, then we have to work towards it. And it's not the role of the artist, it's actually the role of institutions and policymakers.
Yeah, I relate to that a lot, coming from my particular space where we don't even have the luxury of an arts fund or an arts council. Like that doesn't exist, and it's a relatively new idea. But also, I think that question is really important because I wrote down some notes from the video, and I think it's Tamara Al-Mashouk was saying that she's presenting her oppression on a platter for Western consumption. In a way, I don't know, I kind of compare those two things, that artists who work in time-based media, I think you almost gravitate to that way of working because you escape that kind of commodity driven type of work, or you somehow, there's something that it allows, there's a kind of freedom or a direction that it allows in a way. Well, I certainly speak for myself in terms of I live in a particularly collector driven art scope within the Caribbean, which has not really helped our art industry. And so actually using time-based media has been an escape for me from that, where you could produce something that is critical and is it exists, but it does not fit any, it doesn't tick any boxes. It ticks your own box. And if you do need, because time-based media is so flexible and so malleable, you can derive things at any moment, at any time on that continuum. You can get a print, you can get, for me, I've gotten tapestries, but you still have that freedom within the kind of core root of the work. And I think that's how I keep the time-based work, is that it's that core, it's that source for that critical work that Abdullah is talking about. And then at any time I can choose to play in that game or not play that game. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a poignant question, just because I'm like going through a lot of these questions right now, being in the both, like coming from an art field background and education background, but then now with music, I've like jumped into the music industry, which is like a whole nother beast that I am at the early stages of understanding. And then that alongside my practice of doing like sound healing work and oracle readings and things like spiritual based work with a community of folks. So like, yeah, it's been this like weird tension, but I don't know. Yeah, I think based on what Amiko was saying too around it's a time-based work too, and I think it's really like a case-by-case thing of like whoever comes to me and wants to like collaborate or like do something, whether it's like a music sync license or something like that. If it feels right, and if it's in alignment with my values, I think that's what's most important. And but also making sure that I have a sustainable income. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. I wish we could talk forever. But I'm really grateful for what feels like a beginning conversation, and I hope that we all kind of keep in touch about some of the stuff that we've been talking about. But yeah, thank you to Monica and Diani and Abdullah and everyone from RU and everyone who came to watch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.